Hey folks, so recently I had the opportunity to appear on a YouTube channel called Modern Day Debates, and I debated against a libertarian. And at the time, it was simply said that this guy was a libertarian. I assumed there's many libertarians out there. He wasn't one I'd heard of. So I went on and I debated him. Then afterwards I found out he wasn't just any libertarian. This libertarian I debated was Daniel Fishman, and he is the executive director of the Libertarian Party. And when I heard this news, I guess I just hadn't been properly paying attention when his bios were given, my jaw dropped. This man is the executive director of the Libertarian Party, the most high-ranking member of the national political organization that puts forward Milton Friedman, Chicago School, greed is good, get the government's hands off, economic and social liberalism. And you would assume that somebody in his position would be, very, very articulate, would be very, very well read and understanding. And the man I debated just didn't match that by any means. I encourage you to just take a listen. Now, the whole debate is linked below, so you can watch the whole thing, 2.5 hours from beginning to end. But I've selected some key segments of this debate, and watch it closely, right? I mean, this man is the top libertarian in the country. This is the top libertarian in the entire United States, the most high-ranking libertarian. And watch the fact that not only are his arguments completely just platitudes, freedom is good, not really backed up by anything, but beyond that, he seems rather incapable of even understanding the arguments that I make. I find myself repeating myself and trying to get him to understand basic economic data. It's kind of surprising to listen to. This is the face of libertarianism. That many people give the impression, right, that the capitalists of this world, the billionaires and the bankers that run this world, they worked for what they have. They worked hard for what they have, and it's a non-aggression system. They earned what they have, and that leftists and socialists, they believe in force and violence and want to forcibly take away what these people have earned with the sweat of their brow. The reality is that capitalism came into existence with a mass episode of extremely violent theft. Read about the clearing of the commons during the Middle Ages and how people were forced off their land. Read about what was done all across Europe as peasants who had a spot in a feudal estate were forced to become wage laborers, mass executions for homelessness across Europe. Read about the international slave trade, the rosy dawn of capitalism. Read about colonialism that went on. Read about how the land was acquired in the United States by big railroad companies. There's nothing remotely lacking in force about the way capitalism came into existence. It came into existence very violently. And let me add that socialism is simply an effort to organize the economy to serve the people. And this notion that we can have an unregulated market, right, and that we can somehow naturally prevent monopolies from emerging just contradicts the law of the market. As the market proceeds, some companies go out of business, some corporations get bigger, and when one group of people tends to acquire the wealth, they then tend to use their wealth to influence the government to secure their wealth even more. Real capitalism, this is the thing. I always hear, well, it's not capitalism, Caleb. This is crony capitalism. All capitalism is crony capitalism. Whenever wealth concentrates, and I'm talking means of production, I'm talking huge multinational corporations, natural resources, banks, whenever that is acquired in the hands of a small group of people, they tend to then use the government to make sure it stays in their hands and doesn't get taken away from them. All capitalism is crony capitalism, and the modern capitalist state has always existed merely to serve the purpose of making sure that capitalists maintain their wealth, and that the boom-bust cycle under capitalism. This is something that's acknowledged by almost all credible modern economists. The reality of what Karl Marx called it overproduction, John Maynard Keynes called it underconsumption. The fact that the market leads to a situation where you have a glut of products that cannot be sold, workers cannot buy back the products they produced, you have unemployment, and the question is, how do you resolve it? And you brought up Nazi Germany before. Well, in Nazi Germany, the way they resolved it is they created the first military-industrial complex, and they created a system of concentration camps and created the world's first prison industrial complex. And they created a horrendous state to prop up the big corporations like Krupp and Tyson, and it inevitably led to the Second World War, which was one of the greatest disasters in all history. But let me add that at this point, our economy has been propped up by a military-industrial complex, right? The government spends money. It doesn't give it to people like me. It doesn't give it to working people. It gives it to big military corporations to keep this economy rolling ahead and keep churning out production, because this is a naturally unstable system. And with the threat of automation and the low-wage economy so many young people are facing, we cannot continue this. We need a government that will invest in average people and making sure people can see a doctor when they're sick, and making sure people have employment, and building roads and building hospitals and building high-speed railway. We cannot afford to maintain letting our country and the global economy be left up to the dictates of whatever is profitable for a huge millionaire, billionaire class. We need a government of action that will fight for the people and organize society rationally. And let me just add one more point before I conclude. The idea that banking should be in the hands of the state, that long predates Karl Marx, right? That's actually in the Bible, right? Every major religion, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, has forbid the lending of money at interest. And the reason for that is because it leads to a creditor class of people who have money by having money. They lend money at interest and get it back, and pretty soon the governments are in debt to them. Pretty soon all of society is in debt to them, and you have a group of people who created wealth without any actual human labor being involved. When nothing is being created, when wealth is created simply by having other wealth, that leads to a situation where you have a huge gap between the rich and poor, and basically the situation we're in today. So let me add that.
There has never been a monopoly in the history of the earth that didn't happen without collusion by the government. It is government that creates the power. We talk about the fact.
Well, hang on.
Why wouldn't the government do that?
Why does government do it? Because they're paid off.
Yeah, so why, if you had a monopoly, if you had a huge amount of money, why wouldn't you pay the government to give you a monopoly?
I might. The problem is government shouldn't have that power. And whenever
if you're the rich person who's setting the rules, why would you write the rules to not give yourself that power?
Of course you would. That's why you shouldn't allow a system of government that is so authoritarian that it can set rules for other people. Fundamentally, you guys say, I'm worried about all the stuff that corporations are going to do, but I trust government. You can't trust government. Government is what corporation is using. Government is what other people will use as well. When you endow people with that much power, it gets abused. All power resonates from the people. Power to the people. That's what we're talking about. The people are the ones who are supposed to be in control of their own lives and destiny.
What? You're a rich man.
Yes.
Why would you not build a government to then set rules to make you richer?
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. We shouldn't have a government that can do that.
Okay, then we shouldn't have rich people that can build a government that can do that.
No, that's like saying you shouldn't have freedom.
I mean,
and I disagree with that. You should have freedom. And if you want to use your freedom to become a rich person, that's okay. If you want to use your freedom to help the poor, that's okay. I don't get to
hang on. Where does freedom end?
This is where libertarians always strike me as far, far more idealistic than Marxists and communists. I can point to socialist societies and criticize their flaws and failures, but libertarians constantly talk about this ideal world where people will have, huge amounts of wealth and other people will be starving, but there won't be mobs out on the street and there won't be rich, people bribing the government to get an other end. Where has real capitalism ever existed? I mean, what society can you point to as an example of real capitalism?
The best example I would say is the American West after the Civil War, before come in. I mean, at that point in time,
when we murdered all the Native Americans?
Society based on theft. Let me add, though, about the point about the corporation. I don't find anything particularly wrong with the concept, right? A corporation is basically the government and the private sector kind of working together. But I've often articulated to people that the difference between capitalism and socialism is that in capitalism, the corporations control the government. But in socialism, the government controls the corporations. And that's the difference, right? In China, they've got a huge state-controlled telecommunications corporation called Huawei. It makes the best phones in the world. But if you look at it, sure, it's technically private. It's called a cooperative under Chinese law. But if you look at it, its main, business partner is the Chinese military. People on the boards are in the Chinese military, right? It does business in coordination with the, 5-year economic plan set by the Chinese Communist Party. It's basically a state-controlled industry, but it brings in foreign investors. It allows a lot of private companies to do business with them and be contracted by them, right? But Huawei is completely different than Apple in the way that it functions, because Huawei does what the Chinese government says, whereas Donald Trump does what Apple says, right? If you look at it, Donald Trump has declared war on Huawei at this point, just basically because they make better phones, because Apple doesn't want to compete with them. And so Donald Trump is starting a trade war and trying to convince us all, oh my God, Huawei, and going all over the world to stop them in 5G, doing a favor to Apple because and what our private companies can do in the West. As far as Brent and the oil stuff, it's interesting because Russia's economic model at this point, Russia, the fall of the Soviet Union, they privatized all kinds of things, right? And it was a libertarian social experiment. Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University went in there, sold the country off under Yeltsin, Bill Clinton's best bud, who we meddled in their elections and helped Yeltsin get reelected. Everyone knows that. They sold it off, right? And there were times where in the 90s, the Russian government didn't even have the ability to collect taxes. They would try to tax corporations, and they just say, yeah, we have a bigger army than you, so they didn't even care. You should watch some of these documentaries, right? Russia in the 1990s, that is libertarianism in practice. But Putin fixed it by nationalizing oil and gas. He created two state-controlled mega oil energy companies, Rosneft and Gazprom. And now Russia sells oil and gas on the international markets. The revenue goes into the state, and the state then subsidizes other industries like steel manufacturing, like titanium, like all kinds of things. Like they're having at this point a farming boom again, and they're using state-controlled sale of energy. And Venezuela is very similar, right? Venezuela, the government calls itself a socialist government, but if you look at it, their rate of state ownership is much lower than the rate in China, right? I mean, it's really only oil that's controlled by the government, oil and banking. But every private company basically depends on a subsidy from the oil sector to function. So it's not functioning according to the irrational chaos of the market, right? And because of that, they were able to wipe out illiteracy in Venezuela. They were able to have some big achievements. But then
their La Sistema music program was incredible.
Yeah, they did some on that sector. And Gaddafi's Libya is very similar kind of economic model. You can call it petro-socialism, where the government controls a specific resource, sells it on the international markets, and then controls the economy by handing out the revenue from it, right? And that's a model, but it's particularly weak when oil prices drop so dramatically as they did under Barack Obama, when the Saudis were flooding the market with oil and bankrupting themselves. It can cause big problems, as we saw in Venezuela, and other countries had big problems. Iran had big problems. It's an oil-based country, but it's a particularly interesting model. And I guess I just wanted to speak to that. But it is a case where, if you look at, what made like Nigeria, which was an oil-rich country, it's very poor, different than Venezuela, is when the oil was booming. In Venezuela, they were using it to stimulate all of society, whereas in Nigeria, a group of, a handful of people that were in bed with ExxonMobil and Chevron and BP were getting wealthier, and Nigeria's conditions didn't really change. You still have mass illiteracy there. You still have mass homelessness. And I think that when the government controls those resources and is using them to organize the economy, that's different than when you just have, big corporations, buying up a country's natural resources. Now, as far as the thing with Uber, I've done stories. There was a cab driver here in New York City who killed himself because he had spent so many years trying to get a medallion, trying to get that license so he could make that money. Uber comes along, and all of a sudden, cab drivers are making nothing compared to what they used to make. And why? Uber is better than what existed before. It's a technological advance to be able to call them on your phone. It's better. And in a rational socialist society, that would be a good thing. But only under capitalism does technological advance lead to greater poverty, right? That's the reality. Under capitalism, people get poorer as technology advances. This is not rational. People shouldn't become more poor because our economy is becoming more efficient. That's the inherent problem of capitalism.
If you sell something, you shouldn't get paid for it. Right? The thing about it, you said Putin fixed what was broken in communism by essentially stopping people from being independent. You definitely said Putin fixed it.
Putin fixed communism.
Communism was gone by the time.
Communism was gone throughout the Yeltsin years, yeah.
Right. So you talked about the fact that he brought it back, so now the state is subsidizing industries. That's cronyism. That's exactly what you were arguing against beforehand. Cronyism is always bad, okay? When the state is sponsoring the industry, when the state is benefiting things, that's cronyism. That is crony capitalism. The people who have the benevolence from the state, they're the ones who prosper. That is not capitalism. That is cronyism. The two things are different. In capitalism, there is never anybody with power giving any advantage to another, to an organization. Everybody has to compete on merit. Now, a lot of times, there are some things that we can't control. I'm going to buy this thing from my brother rather than, the most competitive art that's out there, or whatever reasons, we might have a cultural thing where I'm only going to buy from my community instead of buying outside of it. But those are voluntary. There's nothing we should do. We shouldn't stop people from supporting people in their community. The state shouldn't get to say, you know what, you have to buy from everybody equitably. You can't just support the people that you like with your business. You get to choose how you allocate your business, who you're going to buy things from. And that's never going to be allowed under communism.
Let me reiterate the point I was making, because I feel like there's kind of a lack of communication. After the fall of the Soviet Union, right, you had, Gorbachev, the Communist Party's forced out. Yeltsin came into office, and he began implementing free market policies, right, where he was privatizing things. George Soros and Jeffrey Sachs were there implementing libertarian Chicago School Milton Friedman economics, right? And
the most Russian forms have ever been, by the way.
And it was a disaster. Right? I mean, mass unemployment, mass drug addiction, mass suicides. I mean, it was, people were starving on the streets. I mean, it was when an economy is just destroyed like that, you have the rise of an underground economy. It was very similar to what happened in Pinochet's Chile, very similar to what happened all across South America when they were implementing these policies in Latin America in the 80s and 90s. And Putin was able to restore Russia's GDP and industrial output, was able to stabilize the economy by reasserting a level of state control. Right?
Why was there an underground economy, the underground economy that you were talking about that developed? Why did that develop?
The overall economy was demolished. American companies would buy steel plants and just close them down. It was the country.
That would be underground. That would just be
bitter, basically. What?
That wouldn't be underground. That would just be the economy.
Well, the underground economy was people were starving, and so they were finding ways to get by, like sell heroin or be involved in crime, and that was what was happening, and that's what happened in Pinochet's Chile as well. Pinochet, ended the food subsidies. He privatized all kinds of things. People were starving. People were desperate, and so yes, child prostitution went through the roof, and drug people do other things. The above ground economy is destroyed. The underground economy flourishes. That's a reality. People have to survive. You're talking about factories were shut down in our urban areas. You saw a rise in the drug trade in urban centers, right? Because people, when they don't have above ground ways to survive, they tend to do underground ways.
There's always going to be bad actors in every society, and whether it's communism, socialism, capitalism, whatever, there are always going to be bad actors. The question is,
so why do we build this? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to finish what you were saying. I didn't want to interrupt you.
What level of authority are you willing to endow somebody with, take away another person's liberty because of that threat? Because really the worst thing you can do to somebody is to take away their liberty. Fundamentally, when you take away liberty, you are approaching slavery. We agreed that slavery is a bad thing, okay? The less liberty I have, the closer I am to slavery. Would we agree on that?
Well, I would say no one in any part of the world was talking about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness until the 1700s in Europe. And there was a reason for that. It wasn't that people were evil until then and they just suddenly became good in 1776 or whenever John Locke started writing. It was that we had not yet reached an economic stage that made that possible. The hunter-gatherer civilization was very authoritarian. Those tribes, people didn't even have a sense of individuality. Right? You had slavery after that. Feudalism introduced a new level of freedom where people had their little tract of land and paid their rent.
What about
economy with that level of freedom? Economic advancement and prosperity leads to a higher level of freedom. That is a reality. And as societies become more prosperous, the level of freedom increases. For example, in the United States, the level of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly that we have now I mean, we didn't really have it up until like 1969, 68, the Warren Court rulings. I mean, I could be put in jail for saying the kind of things I was saying throughout most of the 50s, 30s, 20s. But as the USA became more prosperous and more stable, it became safer to allow dissidents like me to say what we say, right? That freedom and liberty is rooted in economic advancement, and that there is a material basis for it, and that is absent, right? That is a fundamental reality that is missing from all of this. I don't think that all of human history was capable of achieving socialism. Socialism was only possible after capitalism had been achieved, and capitalism capitalism.
We're talking about freedom.
Slavery and capital. You get what I'm saying.
So, I'm going to give you an example. You say nobody's talking about freedom, right? What about Ishmael, right? He goes off and he says, you know what? Fuck these rules. I'm leaving. Can I swear on your show, Converse?
I'll allow it.
Right.
Hey, but how about
Ishmael's like, yeah, I just came
how
out.
about this,
He's
Dan?
living. You guys know the frontier thesis, right? The reason why America is different from any other country is because when you didn't like what was going on, you moved 20 miles to the west and you were on the frontier again. You could do whatever you wanted. That's freedom. And so that idea that you can always go, there was always freedom in old societies, because if you didn't like what it was, you could go somewhere else. Now, there's not really a lot of other place to go, so we have to find a way to live with each other. But freedom is a much older idea.
But we could only go somewhere else because we murdered the Native Americans.
The Old Testament laws, there wasn't very much freedom back then. I mean, I would look at some of the Old Testament laws that existed. It was quite an authoritarian society. One could be killed for saying Jehovah, I believe.
The idea, so I was in Russia in 1985, and since you've been there, you'll be familiar with this phrase, "U vas есть." Do you have? Whenever you go to a Russian restaurant under communism, you didn't order from the menu. You said, "U vas есть." Do you have? Because there were so many shortages that they didn't have anything that was on the menu. That was a constant thing. Long lines. You can see the visit of Boris Yeltsin when he came to the United States, and he couldn't believe, he was in Houston, and he went to a Kroger, and he couldn't believe how much food was in the supermarket. He actually thought it was fake. So they took him to another supermarket and said, "Oh, look, here it is." And he said, "How incredibly efficient, right? 40 different brands of bacon." Dude, bacon's awesome. We should always have 40 brands of bacon.
And then we all die of a heart attack.
No. That's actually food. That's a government telling you that bacon's actually not that bad for you. Haiti is not an example of capitalism. Jean-Jacques Duvalier is probably one of the worst dictators in the history of the planet. Papa Doc.
Thanks so much for that. Caleb, do you want a brief response?
Sure. The fact that the Soviet Union faced an economic blockade and had all kinds of problems, compared to when capitalism was implemented, polls overwhelmingly show Soviet nostalgia is still very high, because people say life was better than what happened when capitalism went in there. And Haiti is a great example of capitalism. In the 1990s, they signed on with NAFTA. They've got free trade. American agribusiness has put all their farmers out of business. People all over the world are fleeing libertarian countries. Guatemala, that's a libertarian country. They got free market, deregulation. They don't even have a government post office anymore. And people are trying to get out as fast as they can. People are trying to flee Honduras. We overthrew the socialist government. They've got a free market regime. People are trying to get out. When Libya was socialist under Gaddafi, people from all over the African continent were trying to get into Libya to get a share of that oil wealth. Now people are drowning in the Mediterranean trying to get out of Libya because Libya has joined the global free trade system, and international oil companies are ruining the place, and the place is in ruin, right? If you look at Eastern Europe, when capitalism was restored, it was an economic disaster. The socialist countries built themselves up from nothing. They built themselves up from nothing, and they've had really big achievements. The United States at this point, we have total free market, unregulated capitalism. This is the most libertarian country in the Western world. And if you compare our education, and the quality of our education to Europe, where it's much more state controlled, if you compare our life expectancy to countries where the government runs healthcare, we are in a mess of individualism here. All over the world, people are fleeing libertarian policies, and the United States at this point is crumbling because we have this belief. We believe greed is good, that profits lead to prosperity. We believe this, right? We believe this, right? People aren't entitled to health care. Why should the government give people health care? That's not my problem. That's the American way. And look how well it's working out for us. This country, with our gap between the rich and poor, I mean, this is capitalism. Capitalism is Honduras. Capitalism is Guatemala. Capitalism is Nigeria. The poorest countries of the world are capitalist. The poorest, this is the reality.
All
so
right,
people are fleeing capitalist countries and voting with their feet. And where are they going?
Brief.
Well, that's not entirely fair.
All right, guys.
We've got all the resources.
Free market African countries are fleeing European countries that have bigger welfare states. People,
why are people going to China?
Hey, guys! I think our moderator wants to say something.
Highly developed United States, which even the USA has more market regulations than like Guatemala does. You know what I mean? Like this is just
so that we can.
This is a distortion. This idea everyone's trying to get out of the socialist countries. This is just hype. I've heard this my whole life, and it's just malarkey, right? I mean, we've all in the United States, and that's the whole thing. If your ideology is the state ideology in the United States, in a government school, I heard the same stuff you've been preaching your whole life. Like my teachers told me that communism never works, capitalism's the best thing. Our state apparatus is feeding us the love for the corporations that run the state, right?
All right.
I mean, you are preaching the state ideology of American imperialism.
All right, Caleb, thanks so much for that.
I mean, there you have it, folks. I mean, this man believes that in the Old Testament Bible times, everyone was free to do whatever they wanted. This man believes that that the Wild West days of the United States were the glorious days, and that the age of showdown at the OK Corral was somehow a good time for the country. Yeah, this is who we're dealing with. Libertarianism is everywhere. It's everywhere because all the small business owners, all the lower levels of capital in the United States support it, right? It would mean lifting any regulation on them, allowing them to viciously exploit their workers as hard as they possibly can. Libertarianism has a lot of money behind it, right? But the fact is, it's malarkey. It's pure malarkey. Unregulated capitalism does not work, and Chicago school policies were a disaster in Eastern Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union, and they were a disaster in Latin America, and they have been continuing to be a disaster here in the United States, where our roads are crumbling and basic societal tasks are not getting done because the government's bankrupt and in debt to bankers. So this is what we're up against, those of us who believe in socialism. We are up against a deeply entrenched ideology that is so full of holes it's unbelievable.